over some money and so on that was owed supposedly to Talbert. And there was a great deal of drinking going on. And before the day was over, there had been Ellison Hatfield wounded. No one knew for sure, but as it turned out, a mortal wound. And you had Hatfields rounding up 3 of the McCoy boys and holding them until they saw what the outcome of Ellison's situation might be. And of course, when Ellison died, as you know, the 3 McCoys were put to death. Now that obviously, if there hadn't been something to produce a real feud between the 2 families, that would have been enough, certainly, to have done it. There were indictments against 20 of the Hatfields and their supporters in the Pike County Court. But they were never apprehended. It was rather a risky business, to say the least. But they remained on the books. And so things sort of smoldered. There were incidents from time to time over the next few years that may have been related to the feud. There were some incidents, frankly, I think, that probably had nothing to do with the feud. But in the minds of many people, they were all interconnected. The matter got into the political situation when Simon Buckner was elected governor of Kentucky. Apparently he had made some commitments to Perry Klein to bring these Hatfields to justice. And there began that period of time when warrants were issued against them and people were brought into the West Virginia area to represent the sheriff of Pike County and began to round up various ones of the Hatfields ultimately. And that was rather a dangerous thing, because if you had the matter brought to court in Pike County, most of the Hatfields were convinced they could not have a fair trial in Pike County. And so that constituted a new danger. There was difficulty ultimately between the governor of West Virginia, Emanuel Willis Wilson, and Governor Buckner of Kentucky. Wilson, of course, Governor Buckner wanted them extradited, the Hatfields extradited to Kentucky. Wilson refused to go along. And he was very suspicious of the nature of the warrants and the intentions of Perry Klein, among others. But the 2 governors reached an impasse. And in order to avoid this trial, New Year's night of 1888, you have the attack upon the Mccoy House, in which 2 of Randolph McCoy's children were killed, Alifair and Calvin, and Randolph's wife was left for dead, although she did survive. And that brought a wave of raids into West Virginia, and ultimately 9 members of the people who were on the Hatfield side of this question were rounded up and lodged in the Kentucky jail, in the Pikeville jail. Now that brought lawsuits in federal courts through the district court in Louisville and the circuit court, the federal U.S. Circuit Court. I went into some of those, but anyhow, ultimately that problem reached the United States Supreme Court on the question of Kentucky officials coming into West Virginia, seizing West Virginians and taking them to Kentucky. And the Supreme Court, I think, rather dodged the issue in a way by simply saying there was no precedent that would force Kentucky to return these West Virginians. From there, then, the thing went on to a point where the trials were held, and as you know, only one of the Hatfield supporters, Ellison Mounts, was actually put to death. He was hanged. Various others were given prison sentences and so on. Now those are some of the things I wanted to ask myself, try to find some answers, and in some cases I found, I think, answers that from the documents that gave me, I thought, pretty conclusive evidence. In some cases, I did not find answers, and I don't know that the answers will ever be known now. But in later years, the feud wound down. And as you know, I'm sure you know these things, so I don't need to belabor them, but ultimately, Devil Anse moved away from this area and over to the Logan area, away from the scenes of the feud, and was ultimately, became a member of the church, baptized, and seemed to have become a gentle old man. Now, Randolph Mccoy, from all the materials that I could find, seems to never have really relented in his feelings against the Hatfields. He seemed to remain bitter almost to the end, or to the end. But the whole question, the whole matter, can, I think, be determined in broad outlines. But to try to say that what facts can be established represent what the people know about the feud, I think is again, something totally different. Because during the time of the feud, and especially after 1888, the press outside West Virginia, as well as inside West Virginia, began to take up the matter. And for example, you have correspondence from Pittsburgh papers, New York papers, and others coming into the area to gather information on the feud and to report it to a national audience that was devouring these stories of these goings-on here in the wilds of West Virginia and Kentucky, so to speak. And for example, one of the reporters from the Pittsburgh papers came down to, as he expressed it, to get the truth of the matter and to let the nation know the real story, the real facts. And he spent 3 days in the Pikeville area interviewing the McCoys and never talked to the Hatfields. Well, now you can see that for whatever reason, that immediately causes his stories to be rather suspect. Because obviously, if you're going to try to be legitimate in a sense in your writings, you have to try to get all of the information from whatever sources and to assimilate it and evaluate it. But there was no attempt there. One of the reporters, for example, T.C. Crawford, wrote quite a lengthy account called An American Vendetta, in which he, again, pictured the feud in extreme ways. And generally speaking, most of these outside writers, I think, were extremely critical of Devil Anse. Maybe just the very title, the very name, gave them a clue as to what they would do. But at any rate, they were highly critical of Devil Anse, pictured him almost as some kind of a fiend, and in some cases, painted the whole thing in black and white, where there was groups that were basically evil and others were victims, when probably that wasn't quite the way it was. There was probably guilt on both sides and some innocence on both sides. But these people, I think in the long run, were about as much victims of these sensational reporters as they were of each other. The pictures of the feud and the descriptions of the feud and the writings on the feud have generally, I think, tended to perpetuate a certain image that many people have of the Appalachian region, that basically the people of this area of the country are backward, lawless, uneducated, crude, almost devoid of all of the humane characteristics. And that, I think, is a totally false image, because you can read not only some accounts of Devil Anse Hatfield and his way of dealing with visitors to his home. The man could be very generous, very kind, and considerate. But that was an Appalachian trait, not just with the Hatfields and the McCoys. I have run across so many examples of that, of travelers who came through this region. They might find the people living in great poverty, in great ignorance in a sense of the outside world. But at the same time, as my grandmother used to say, they were very, very clever. And I used to think, well, Grandma certainly misused that word. I always thought of a clever person as someone with a great deal of ingenuity and so on. Grandma didn't use it that way. She used it to mean that the person was agreeable, friendly, generous. And so I think a lot of people who don't really know the Appalachian region miss a great many of these traits and characteristics that some of us who've been around a good while know do exist here. But I had a great deal of, I'll use the word fun, in doing this particular book, because I learned quite a bit myself. In other words, I had to educate myself to some degree on this whole question. I had found out that when I started, I had a great deal of, like many other people, I had a great deal of misinformation to start with. And so in trying to untangle what I found to be defensible and what was indefensible, it was rather an interesting thing. I would tell you this, just above where I have spent most of my life, I suppose most of you are familiar with where Montgomery is, but just about 3 miles above Montgomery is a little town of Boomer. And Boomer, at one time, in the history of the early coal mining of the region, Boomer was a town that was very, very heavily Italian, and still a sizable Italian population there. But in the days of the saloons, there was a man who was rather a well-known person and politically prominent, powerful, a man by the name of M.J. Sims, who really built a whole block of Montgomery and owned it. But he had a saloon at Boomer. He had a competitor just about 1.5 miles away at Cannelton, who was in the saloon business there, and the two men finally agreed that they would divide that business. Mr. Sims would keep within a certain range of Boomer, and the other man would keep his business confined to Cannelton. But it turned out that Mr. Hanson, the Cannelton operator, apparently had one of his men who got out and did some selling and so on to get over into the Boomer territory. And that brought a real clash between the two. But at any rate, Mr. Sims had engaged to look after some of his business 2 young men by the name of Hatfield, Troy and Elias, both sons of Devil Anse. And ultimately, since the quarrel over the turf or the territory hadn't been resolved, the 2 Hatfields went down to Cannelton to talk with the man who was representing the Cannelton operator, a man by the name of Jerome, an Italian. And they went to Mr. Jerome's house. One of them went to the back door, one to the front door. And Mr. Jerome knew exactly what they were coming for. And so he shot one and then shot the other, killed him, but he himself was killed. But there was a kind of a violent act in a sense that involved two of the Hatfields right close to where I live. I had a friend who died just recently. He was in his 90s, and Mr. Dave Tamplin, who had been there all of his life. He knew everybody and practically that history of that area almost from first-hand experience. But he was one of the very first people following the shots that were fired at that house to go there, and when they were all lying there dead. But he remembered all of that very vividly. Now, I have kind of rambled just a little bit, and I'll be glad to try to answer questions or to say something, but not necessarily, I'll not guarantee that I'll always be able to answer a question. I can do my best.
How much time did it take you to collect the information?
I spent about 3 years with this. And of course I had a job I had to do too. That's been the story of my life. I've always done something while I'm doing another job. But I spent roughly about 3 years at it. This book was published originally in 1978, and they asked me in 75.
My question is, where did you get the photo?
Oh, dear lands, do I have an acknowledgement in there?
I looked at it.
All right,
Nothing
if,
is there, is there?
no, all right, then what I think, most of these, if I don't have an acknowledgement, yes, the West Virginia Department of Archives and History, if you look right up at the, isn't this the same one, or part of the same one, or is it? Yes, it is. This picture is a part of this one, but it came from the Archives and History in Charleston. Most of my photographs several of them came from there. One of the things about this book that I probably should say, to start out with, I had some limitations, and that was that the book was one of a series, and there were certain limits in terms of length, number of pictures, and so on that were to go into the book simply because it had to fit the general pattern of the series.
You do have some Hatfield-McCoys here.
I thought so. I remember several years ago I taught at Marshall one summer, and I had Miss Hatfield sitting beside Miss McCoy in class, and they were very friendly, incidentally, of course.
I think I'll take this time. This is Charles Hatfield, Dr. Rice, and he would like to make a special presentation.
Oh,
to
I
you.
would be very glad.
I have some prints here that were done by my brother-in-law of the Hatfields-McCoys, and I'd like to present those to you.
Oh, I'm grateful and delighted. Devil Ants. That's a very, very nice thing. And Randolph McCoy.
That was the Reverend Anderson Hatfield's house.
Oh, yes. And this is the Randolph McCoy house. Well, I do appreciate them. I'll treasure them.
Those are prints by J.D. Hall.
All right. Well, I certainly do appreciate them. Incidentally, I would say this. This book has, despite its small size and so on, has, I think, gotten a lot of attention. I have had letters from all over this country and from Canada and other places. Just in the last 2 weeks, I had a letter from a woman in California, and she gave me the name of her, I think it was her great-grandfather. I have not responded to the letter, and in fact, I'll have to write to her and tell her I don't know, which is not an uncommon answer. But anyhow, she said that her grandfather, or great-grandmother, I believe it was supposed to have been the illegitimate daughter of Devil Ants Hatfield. Could I help her out and tell her if that was true? Well, if we can't get Rosanna's child established as whether it was a boy or a girl, you can imagine I'm not going to, I don't think, be very successful at that. And then about a week ago, I had a letter from a woman in British Columbia, and she said that, and I'll have to look at the letter, but I think it was her great-grandfather was Slim Hatfield. She didn't give me any other name. He was known as Slim Hatfield. and she had always heard them say that he was related to the West Virginia Hatfields. Do you know the answer to that? I don't either at this point, but I thought I would try to see if I could find anything that anybody was ever referred to as Slim, and at least if I can give her a clue to take it from there. But it's been surprising how, and I've gotten letters from every part of this country, from Florida to California, and as I say, from British Columbia, and I've always tried to answer them, and sometime if I could be of help, I was pleased, but in many cases I'm afraid that I couldn't get into very much detail on the genealogical aspects of the two families.
Any other questions?
Is your information on the victim collecting that, did you get it from people, other than the
Not very much, no. I'll tell you the two things. I was limited to time as well as to space, and what I tried to do was to get into records, court records, affidavits, statements that had been made under oath, and so on, and I felt that within what I was trying to do, that would allow me to get about as close to things and to be probably as accurate. Now, if I'd have had more time and more space, I would have gone into some detail, and especially with more interviews with people who are descendants who have heard, versions of the story and things of that sort. But I did not get to do much of that.
Okay. Well, Dr. Rice, we really appreciate your coming to be with us today.
Well,
Thank
I'm
you.
delighted to be here.
I have to tell just one brief story, my Hatfield-McCoy story, okay? I was telling Dr. Rice earlier, my grandfather, Charles Carlson, came here from North Carolina to doctor the ponies and the mules in the mines during the early 1900s. And my father went with him one time to Devil Lance's house on Island Creek, and they ate dinner there. Of course, my father was very small then, but he said afterwards, this is a family story, he said Devil Lance always told him to sit with his back to the wall. And when in our family, we do sit with our back to the wall. If we go to a restaurant, we don't like to sit in the middle. We like to sit on the perimeter. I think a lot of Appalachians are like that. But anyway, but he said he was very hospitable. And, of course, he was an older man then, and he died in, I think we said 21. So that was kind of interesting. Okay, thank you all for coming, and please stay for the reception.